This episode is brought to you by Mind Happy. We all spend way too much time in front of screens. I know I do, and I find myself craving creative yet restful analog activity. I never thought I would long for the downtime of my childhood in the 90s making friendship bracelets at summer camp. This is why we were so excited when we discovered Mind Happy. Mind Happy is a lifestyle and wellness brand centered on thoughtful creativity to help people craft fulfilling moments, connections, and self care rituals through purposeful play. Mind Happy provides curated monthly deliveries that promote phone free activities like knitting, coloring, and crafting. They believe that play is one of the most effective ways to relax and re energize in our daily lives.
Mind Happy's founder is an ex Amazon executive who leveraged similar activities to alleviate her own burnout. All the phone free activities from music box building to coloring are selected based on science, restoring mental clarity, energizing connections, reducing anxiety, and facilitating fulfilling moments. It is curated monthly self care delivered right to your door. We love that the products from each box are primarily sourced from small women owned business. For 15% off your first month subscription, go to mindhappy.com. That's mindhappy.com and use code courage15 at checkout. Welcome to Courageous Wellness. My name is Erica Stein.
And I'm Allie French, and this is a podcast about individual journeys within wellness and how to navigate it all.
After Allie experienced a cancer diagnosis in her 20s,
and Erica went through a self-love journey, we created a platform to interview real people from all walks of life that have combined all types of practices. From physical wellness to emotional and spiritual, we hear courageous stories and focus on why it's important to share them.
We are both certified integrative nutrition health coaches, and together with our community are learning to live our most purposeful lives by sharing one courageous story at a time.
It takes courage to share these journeys, and by talking about them, we aim to destigmatize the process. We want you to be your own health advocate, feel educated and informed on the latest in health and wellness, and empower you to feel your absolute best.
And because we want to bring forth a wide variety of stories, the opinions of our guests do not necessarily reflect our own, but we hope the diverse and varied stories will empower you to make the best choices for your own life. So join us as we and our community share our courageous wellness. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this week's episode of Courageous Wellness. We have such a great episode today with Sahaj of Brown Girl Therapy. And it was such a good conversation that I can't wait for everyone to listen to. But before we get into it, we are going to share our weekly updates. And so I'm going to start because mine is a little short and it kind of references to Monday's episode. We're releasing little Monday mini-sodes now every week, just the two of us. And this week we talked a lot about grief and dealing with family illness. And I shared, an update about my father-in-law's journey, with Alzheimer's. He's been, battling it for the last, 4.5, almost 5 years. And we're progressing very quickly now at this point. So if you want to listen to that episode with Allie and I talking about grief and mental health, you can check that out from Monday. But I guess my update is, there's some good, exciting things happening in my life that I am excited to share very soon on the show. But with joy, when you are dealing with family health issues, it's like a heavier joy that is new. And I see it in my husband. I see it with everything going on where, it's kind of like I have friends who have lost both their parents and they're like, oh, they won't be at my wedding, even if my wedding is so joyful, or if you have a baby, or if you, whatever it may be, it's
It's bittersweet.
it's bittersweet. And
Yeah.
so I guess that's kind of my update this week that, we'll continue to explore. And if you've been through it, I know you understand, but it's like, when you get good news or moments of intense joy, it's like you feel their lack of presence in those
Yeah.
moments even more. And
Yeah.
so, and again, we talked about this, but Alzheimer's is a weird one because he's still physically here, but
Right.
he's
He's
not
not
here
able to be
anymore.
here. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of sorry, not to start off such a great episode with
No.
such a heavy update, but it's an honest update and it's kind of where I've been this week. And so, yeah, that's my
Yeah.
update.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. And mine is a little bit work related. So I know most of our listeners know that I intersect the worlds of integrative nutrition and musical theater. I'm sure no one else has ever said that on this podcast, at least.
I love it.
Um, and so I was a musical theater performer for many years around the globe. And, obviously our listeners know my passion for integrative nutrition. And I wanted to combine these two things and create a resource for the musical theater performer community, which is very niche, but we're small but mighty. And so that people can have something accessible to help them support their throat health, their immune system, their energy when you're doing 8 shows a week. I mean, it's an enormous amount of output. And I wanted to create something that I could give to members of my other community that could help them and support them. And I recently did a live event for a musical theater workshop, which went really well. It was a lot of fun and I learned a lot. I got a lot of great feedback too from the participants. So I'm putting together an e-resource that will be sold through Courageous Wellness. Um, and I'm excited. I've just been like hard at work on it. And it's like there's always something to add. There's always something else to like refine and edit. And but it's been nice to have this little creative project. So if anybody happens to fall into that world, keep an eye out. I'm sure we'll be announcing it once it's ready. And that timeline is purely based on how quickly Allie continues to work.
I just have to say, I'm not a musical theater performer, only in my shower, but I think it's so cool. And I think it's really cool. And again, it's whether or not you are in musical theater, it's really important information, I think, for all of us. But I think especially if you are a performer, because you are an athlete. I think that's the thing. I think singers, actors, dancers, you become an athlete when you are performing at that level. And so I don't think I mean, before knowing and having friends in that world, I didn't think of it that way, and that
Yeah.
was a wrong thought. So
Well, no, it's just that our bodies are our sort of tools, our instruments that we have to use whenever you go to work. And so it's like, how can we feel our best? And I just want the experience to be as optimized as possible for
so cool.
anybody who has to, has that kind of like strenuous schedule in that world and in that space. So yeah, keep an eye out for it. And if you're not a musical theater singer, it actually has some just generally good
Good info.
nutrition sort of content as
Yeah.
well.
Well,
So
it's
it can
like
be helpful for
Allie,
everybody.
I always think of when Allie was performing in Japan, you were doing 16 shows a week,
It was
right?
like somewhere between 13 and 15, but yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. But we do have such a great episode today. I gained so much from it. I can't wait to listen to it again. So should we get into it?
Let's do it. So today we sit down with Sahaj Kohli, a practicing therapist, writer, and speaker on a mission to make mental health care more diverse, equitable, accessible, and inclusive. As the first in her family to do many things, she was born in the West, went to therapy, and married outside of her religion, race, and culture. Sahaj has a unique understanding regarding the struggles of children of immigrants and uses her personal experiences to create original resources and content for this underserved population. In 2019, Sahaj founded Brown Girl Therapy, the first and largest mental health and wellness community organization for children of immigrants. Sahaj takes her role as a community advocate seriously, and through her career development, she has taken on additional roles such as speaker, consultant, and educator.
Prior to becoming a therapist, Sahaj had a 6+ year career in journalism, where she worked as a senior editor, working closely with a diverse network of freelancers on a daily basis. In this role, Sahaj specialized in mental health and identity driven content, particularly essays involving disability, mental illness, sexuality, gender, race, and culture. Sahaj's passion lies at the intersection of narrative storytelling and mental health advocacy. She continues to write as a freelancer, and she has a weekly advice column with the Washington Post. Her new book is out now and is titled But What Will People Say?, which she beautifully discusses with us in today's episode. So you can follow along with her at Brown Girl Therapy on Instagram and find her book wherever books are sold. Enjoy the episode. This episode is brought to you by Sprout Living. One of our favorite new snacks are Sprout Living's probiotic almonds. Wildly delicious and irresistibly crunchy, these are the perfect gut-healthy balanced snack. Each pack of the sprouted and activated organic almonds contain 10 billion CFUs of probiotics, 6 grams of clean plant protein, and a variety of other superfood spices and herbs that do the body good.
They're made without seed oils, which we all know are out, and the flavors. The Italian truffle is delicious, and the dairy-free cheddar cheese made with turmeric and nutritional yeast always hits the spot. Honestly, we may never have another chip again. Sprout Living also makes our favorite plant-based protein blends. My personal favorite is the coffee flavor.
If you want to try Sprout Living, you can save 20% off your entire order by using code COURAGEOUS at checkout. Visit www.sproutliving.com and use code COURAGEOUS to save 20%. Give them a try and let us know if you love them as much as we do. You can also find the direct links in our show notes.
Thank you, Sahaj, for joining us today. Erica and I are really happy to have you on the show. And I know our listeners are excited to hear this conversation as well. So just to get us started, can you share with us a little bit about who you are and your personal background?
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. So, I am a daughter of Indian immigrants, a granddaughter of refugees, first in my family to be born in the West, first in my family to talk about mental health openly, first in my family to go to therapy, first in my family to marry outside of race, religion, and culture, first to do a lot of things. And so, my entire life has kind of been me just straddling between two diametrically opposing cultural sets of cultural expectations, values, norms, what have you. And so that's a really important part of who I am and how I show up in my life and my relationships. But more generally, I am the founder of Brown Girl Therapy, the first and largest mental health community for children of immigrants. I'm a therapist. I'm a writer. I have an advice column at the Washington Post called Ask Sahaj. Also, I have a book coming out, which is what we're talking about today, called But What Will People Say? And yeah, I think that's a little bit about me. I don't know what else to say there.
Thank you. Thank you. I love the title of your book, What Will People Say? And as we mentioned a little bit before recording, we're really big fans of your platform. A lot of our friends are huge fans of your platform as well. And I want to get into the book, the platform, everything. But first, just to unpack a little bit more about your own personal journey, right? As you just mentioned, you were the first in your family to talk about mental health. You were the first in your family to go to therapy, to marry outside of race, religion, and culture. Those are really, 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 really big things. Can you, and it takes a lot of courage, right, to do those things. Can you maybe walk us through or talk a little bit about maybe even starting, I'd love to go into marrying outside of race, religion, and culture too, because I know that's huge for so many people. But let's start with maybe the mental health and therapy. When you started talking about mental health, going to therapy, how did your family react? Because even in my own family, I was the first to go to therapy, and they literally thought I was going to be brainwashed to like hate them. My dad literally said that to me. So I can't even imagine.
Yeah, I mean it's the stigma is real, and it causes people to internalize all of these beliefs and narratives around mental health care, around therapy, around quote unquote airing dirty laundry, all of these things that we're conditioned, especially in cultures or families where you have to keep it in the family to not do. And so the first time I sought therapy actually was in my early 20s, I knew I needed professional care then because I had just gone through something traumatic. I was living at home at the time. I didn't have any knowledge about what professional mental health care looked like at that time. And my parents were terrified. They were like, if you need to see a professional, we failed you. As immigrants, we failed you. We brought you to this country. We were supposed to make your life better, easier. And now you need to talk to an outsider about your problems. So they really internalized that as something that they did wrong. And at the time, I didn't have the language I have now, which is to really sit with those fears and have a lot of empathy and compassion and say, this is not a you thing. This is just, I have access to resources and opportunities you didn't have and you don't know about. So it seems scary to you. But fast forward, I didn't actually get the therapy I needed them because of those fears. And so it took years later for me to get physical distance, emotional distance from my parents and my family. I moved out of state. And it was only through becoming financially independent and seeking therapy myself was that I was able to actually get the care that I needed. And so during that time, I actually chose not to tell my family at first and kind of go to therapy, get support, talk things out, and then tell them once I had the confidence to say, hey, I'm doing this. And I think at that point, the concern for them was less about you're talking to an outsider was like, why are you spending money on this? Why don't you just talk to us? Like, you have friends, you have family. Why do you need this? Like, it's a waste of money. And I think for a lot of people, it doesn't matter where you come from, but especially in immigrant communities, it's considered, something that white people do, that Western people do. It's not something we do. And there's a lot of historical trauma wrapped up into that, depending on who you ask, with the medical care system, with feeling misunderstood, with feeling like they're not going to be able to help you because they're not going to understand you. And those are all very real and valid concerns that people still have today. But it took a lot of hard conversations. And of course, now I'm a therapist, and my parents are like, wow, we totally respect everything you do. And we like understand it. But I don't know that they truly understand my work. I think for them, they can respect it and they can accept it. But I don't know that it's not like tomorrow they're going to go seek out therapy themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it all makes sense in the way that you explain it with the complexity. And I'm curious, and this is something you do touch on in the book, with therapy and kind of the overall encompassing umbrella of the medical system, the Western medical system, historically being, um, I don't know if like whitewashed is the right term, but sort of from a Western, like patriarchal, kind of like white gaze that doesn't necessarily account always for the intersectionality and complexity of like the cultural components that you bring up. If anybody's listening to this conversation now, obviously you've created Brown Girl Therapy, you've created, more access to sort of like therapy in this with the cultural compassion and sensitivity and what's the word, like encompassing those complexities
Mhm.
and those nuances. But if someone, I'm curious, like from your own journey, finding the right therapist or finding the right care can sometimes be a process and an iteration for anybody. So how would you maybe suggest or support someone who wants to seek that
Mhm.
um, and seek that support in a way that also encompasses the kind of cultural nuance that's necessary that isn't always a part of it systemically?
I mean, that's a great question. So, yeah, as you said, I trained to be a therapist in the US, and a lot of what was taught was Eurocentric, was about individualism. It's normed and created by a population that didn't represent me or the population I want to serve. And so I was very frustrated through graduate school. And I was also very empowered to create these spaces because, as you said, I think what needs to happen is we need to infuse culture into these conversations. And so if someone listening wants to seek therapy and is like, I mean, I get that question all the time. It's not for me. How do I find a therapist who's going to understand? How do I find a therapist who's going to be able to help me or try to listen to my stories without judging me? And I get that because I have seen therapists myself who have pathologized culture, who have um, made me feel judged for maybe not having enough of a quote unquote boundary with my parents, or, having norms and values with my parents that they didn't understand or really, have themselves. And I totally get those fears. And I think what people need to understand is that when you're seeking out a therapist, you are paying for a service. And so you have full agency to ask questions, to try to understand what therapy will look like with this therapist. Most therapists, if not all, but most therapists will offer a free consultation. And so kind of be honest with yourself about what is it that you think that you need to feel comfortable in the room with a therapist. For some people, it is a shared identity. For other people, it's just maybe a person of color or someone of the same gender or someone of the same sexuality. Just get honest with yourself about what you need to feel comfortable, because at the end of the day, research suggests that therapy is the most successful if the client feels comfortable with the therapist. That is the number one indicator of success, is that a client feels comfortable in the room. So you want to make sure you feel comfortable. And I say that because some people say, oh, I have to see someone who shares with my identity. But then I ask questions like, well, what if it's someone who's a little older, but is Indian like you? Will that make you feel like you're speaking to an auntie or an uncle? Or will that make you feel like you're speaking to someone of your parents' generation and make you feel judged? So just getting really clear on what those parameters are for you to feel comfortable. And then schedule those consultations, and schedule many, because as you said, it can be really hard. And sometimes it's like dating or finding the perfect pair of shoes, right? My perfect pair of shoes is going to fit my feet very differently than someone else's feet. And so asking questions during consultation: what does it look like? What does therapy look like in the room with you? What do you think your role is as a therapist? How will you be able to help me with X? Or I have Y. I have Y identity. Have you ever worked with someone who identifies like that? And just asking these questions to kind of tease out, how do they respond? Do you like the way they respond? Do you feel comfortable with them? Some people feel like, oh, I don't need someone who shares my identity. I just need them to be curious. And it really is about what you're comfortable with. So I think cultural context and nuance is really important, but how you feel and how comfortable you are is even more important than that.
That's such great advice. And as you mentioned with cultural context and nuance, right? You mentioned boundaries, right? And this word boundaries is so buzzy. We all need boundaries, right? We do. We all do need boundaries. However, you also mentioned earlier, you said when you took physical and emotional distance from your family, right? You were able to have maybe boundaries and seek therapy for the first time. You know, I would love to talk about this because I'm sure it even connects to how you were able, right? As we talked about, you married somebody outside of your culture. Um, I talk to so many friends who are first gen, and they've literally said to me word for word, I just can't not do this for my parents. Like I can't say no to my parents in this way, or this is just how, like, I have to do this, right? Even at the expense of mental, physical, emotional health. And so, and then, a friend with good intentions or somebody could be like, oh, but like, what about boundaries? Right. So how were you able to find those boundaries to take that physical distance from your family? And how do you suggest other people who might feel like that enmeshment, for lack of a better word, is unbreakable because of X, Y, and Z?
Great question. A couple things come up here. The first is even the term enmeshment, right? So I want to start there. In a Western world, in Western research, enmeshment is considered bad. And I understand that, right? If you don't have boundaries with people, you lose your sense of self. Maybe you put them first at the expense of yourself, and that can be unhealthy, but it depends on who you ask. And it's also important to recognize that research suggests that immigrants and people from collectivist cultures are more enmeshed because it's actually a protective mechanism to be so insular, to protect them from the dominant society or harm from the dominant society. So when you reframe it like that, I think for a lot of people, it offers compassion to say, oh, my parents may hold so tight to me or hold me so close because they're scared, because they want to protect me. And that can offer a level of compassion and empathy that maybe will help diffuse or minimize level of frustration and defensiveness that someone might feel. Now, I understand that that might not be enough for people. So, how do we set boundaries? And boundaries, again, in the Western world, we're taught be explicit, cut them out, say no, be direct. But what happens when you come from a culture or family where you are meant to be, it's hierarchical, or respect is one way, or being quiet and submissive and listening are signs of wisdom or respect, right? Being direct is not going to be the way you set a boundary. So with my clients and in my work, I really focus on behavioral boundaries. And so, like you said, for me, that was leaving the environment. But that was also me having to build up the confidence and the tools and have everything ready to be able to say, okay, I am removing myself from this environment. Something that helped me there too was focusing on something that my parents could understand, which was my education, my career. I need to leave this environment in order to like move on with my career, to get this job, to do this thing I want to do. And that helped them understand, okay, maybe I don't love this, maybe I'm scared for my daughter, but she's also doing this for a reason I can understand, which is security, stability, career, all of these things. And so maybe reframing why you're setting a boundary in language that they can understand is really helpful. But then it comes to behavioral boundaries, right? So if you don't live at home, how, picking up the phone. For some of us, it's just instinctual to always be there for our family and for our parents. And so what I tell my clients is like, take a pause. Do you want to pick up the phone right now? If they're not physically here, that's a behavioral boundary you're allowed to set. You're allowed to call them back later. You're allowed to call them back tomorrow or the next day. How much time you spend at home, right? Some people say, well, they expect me to be home for the whole week. I have to go home the whole week. Do you? Can you offer a compromise and say, hey, I'm going to come home for 3 days instead of 7? Or can you offer something to get something? So the give and get is something that I think really works with children of immigrants or people who struggle with boundaries. And that's saying, if my parents are asking for something from me, maybe I feel like I can't not do it, but can I decide when to do it? Can I change it to tomorrow and instead, say, hey, I will do that for you, but it's going to be Friday. It's not going to be today. And that way you feel like you're protecting the time that maybe you need right now, but you're still doing the thing for them. And I think around all of these conversations, it's self-care versus other care, right? For so many of us, we, especially now when in social media and all of this conversation around taking care of ourselves and being better and self, we forget about the roles that we play. And for many children of immigrants, the roles that we play in our families and in our communities are just as important to us as taking care of ourselves. So I think reframing self-care as a form of community care. How can you take care of yourself now to show up better in those roles, to be someone who actually is enjoying the roles you're playing as a daughter, as a kid, as an aunt, whatever. And so really reframing it in that way to help you feel like, okay, I'm not just taking away from my parents. I'm not just saying no to them. I'm not just being rude. I'm actually doing something that will help me show up better in that relationship with them. And so really reframing these conversations from the relational roles that we play, from a way that really infuses how we communicate with our parents, what is culturally apt, will help people set better boundaries in those relationships.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that in the reframing to away, not just away from the individual, but like incorporating, I guess, both, right? You said the community, that those two things don't need to be like diametrically in opposition to each other. It actually reminds me of this concept in the Buddhism that Erica and I practice, which is like practice for self and others. It's not practice just for self, and it's not practice just for others. It's practice for both. And those two things like are intrinsically linked. And when you serve others, it's also a benefit to you. And when you care for yourself, it's also can be a benefit to others. And so those like that's sort of the way I was able to really understand that concept because I do think Western, I was reading something about this, like in a lot of Western culture, we've lost a lot of the family intergenerational sort of like family connections. And there's actually some research out there. I can't tell you where it's from right now off the top of my head, but I was reading about that says like children who have relationships with their grandparents, like close relationships with their grandparents, it's actually it actually lengthens the life expectancy of the grandchild by being close or living in close proximity intergenerationally, which I know, I think I'm third generation American, four. Well, it depends on like some sides of my family. But I know that my mom was saying recently, like, because I had grandparents that just passed, and with their passing, all of the cousins all of the siblings who we all grew up near each other. And my grandparents were the glue of that, but they were first gen. And we all still live near each other and spent time together. And now we're across the country. Nobody has that intergenerational like living situation. And I do think that historically, regardless of where the immigrant families came to the US from, there was a closeness from a generational standpoint. And I think I'm sure some still are that way who are, newer um immigrant families or first gen, but that there is like real positive aspects to that too, which we've really lost. And yes, sometimes family boundaries are really, like you said, important, but sometimes it's not one or the other. It's like how do we integrate both? And I think your exploration of that, because it's so relevant in your life and in the people in your community's lives as well, shine light on that where it's like, it's not just a burden. It can also be a benefit to have the intergenerational sort of responsibilities as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And I write about intergenerational narratives in my book, right? We talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, but there is the other side of that. There's the intergenerational resilience and the dreams and the strength and the resourcefulness and all of these things that get passed down. And so, to your point, intergenerational narratives and having access to people who are older, your elders in your family or elders in your culture, elders in your community, they not only help you feel like I guess the research that you're talking about, which is amazing, that strengthening your life, your lifespan, but it's also helping you feel rooted in your identity and where you come from and the people you come from. And I know that one, I mean, when my parents moved to the US, first the UK, then the US, they were the only ones to do so. So I didn't have really access to my grandparents. I didn't really have access to my extended family. It was just me, my siblings, and my parents in the US, and that's it. And so that almost caused them to be even more protective and like controlling to some degree because it was just them and us and they were in charge of taking care of us in this new country and that was it. But to your point, a lot of immigrants do come here and then they live in multi-generational households and they have their grandparents and they have access to them, and so depending on who you ask, that access can be really quite meaningful, or that lack of access can cause a level of grief that you kind of live with for your whole life.
Well, and that concept too of grief and even guilt, right? I think is very common and painful. And navigating, there's so many emotions, right, that you have to navigate in order to fundamentally, I don't know if choose yourself is the right word, but like move forward in a way that is in alignment with your own physical, mental, emotional well-being. How do you suggest people work through feelings of guilt or grief? Because even sometimes, and again, I come from a culturally Jewish family, and I loved your reframe of enmeshment because, my family is very enmeshed. And I was like, oh, that's a nice way to look at it that I had never heard before. But when I started putting up healthy boundaries and prioritizing my own physical, mental, and emotional health, it did feel a little like I was dying, just for lack of, like, it felt like dying not to take my mom's like fourth phone call of the day or whatever it may be, or to not show up to whatever it was because that wasn't good for me. And I know it's, the volume is raised 1,000,000% when you're dealing with, if you're first generation or if you're an immigrant, and this responsibility and guilt that you feel, again, volume way up. So I don't know if you have, I know you have suggestions for,
I
but
have
can you
many.
share some of your suggestions for dealing with that guilt and grief?
I have so many. Yes, it's such a great question. And yeah, the guilt, well, let's start with the grief. So the grief is, for some people, can be so constant. And I think what happens, and I studied this in my grief counseling class, even though there was minimal research, but I really studied grief for immigrants and children of immigrants, and this idea of both cultural bereavement and disenfranchised grief. So cultural bereavement is when you are grieving the loss of your culture, right? And that term started with was studied mostly with refugees, but I think it extends into immigrants and their children who are just losing access to their culture. And not just losing it, right? Like you assimilate, you acculturate into a new culture, you start to celebrate different holidays because everyone else in the country is doing it, and then you have to be more intentional about infusing your own culture into your life. Um, and so there's a little bit of a cultural bereavement, but then there's also a disenfranchised grief, which is a grief that is not socially accepted or recognized by the dominant society. And so I think about stories of maybe immigrants and their children who move here and loss, a loss of their social support, a loss of the social capital, a loss of just the ease of being in their home country, that level of grief that comes up every day, or children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants who are grieving a loss of their elders, the loss of the oral stories that weren't passed down, things that they may never know or have access to, right? There's so many clients I work with whose grandparents pass in their countries of origin, and they're like, well, what does it mean now for me to visit that place? They're no longer there. I only visited that place to go meet my family, and now they're no longer here. So there's a constant level of grief that kind of happens that you just live with. And to deal with those, I really do. There's a theory called cultural bonds theory, and that's something I really use in my work as a therapist. And it's about how can you maintain and find meaning in these bonds, even if they're no longer physically present, and actually keep them going. So ritualizing days that matter, having your own experiences with these countries of origin, even if those people are no longer here, reconnecting with your roots in ways that feel meaningful to you, whether it's a recipe that your grandparent used to like, or wearing something of theirs, or celebrating something that was important to them. And so really keeping your identity and your roots going, for lack of better words. And so that's something I really do with my clients.
This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you ever get that feeling you just need to get something off your chest to really talk it out? I got to that place the other day when I felt like I was juggling just too many things to manage. We all carry around different stressors, big and small, but when we keep them bottled up, it can really start to affect us negatively. But what Erica and I both love about therapy is that it's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself, and therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever is weighing you down. It truly can be for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/CWPod today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/CWPod.
Guilt is a different story. Guilt, I mean, they're tied. They can, I have a whole chapter on how they kind of they kind of work off one another. But guilt is something that I see in children of immigrants and just people who come from enmeshed families, where it's like, I mean, like you said, it's almost like you're dying. It's like if I separate myself, I'm literally like cutting off parts of myself, or severing the limbs of these relationships. It can be quite painful for people. And what I think is happening is that there's no question, there's no like pause happening. It's like I do this, I feel guilt, it's bad, I feel like crap. But like we have to instill pauses into these experiences. And so I do something, why am I doing it? Am I actually crossing a moral, line here? Am I actually causing harm to someone? Whose values am I crossing? Am I crossing my values, or am I crossing a cultural or a family value that I actually don't uphold myself? So really interrogating, why am I doing this? What are the values behind it? Whose values am I crossing? Because then that'll help identify for you whether that guilt is something that you need to amend. Like, right, guilt teaches us we need to amend our behavior. And so we need to think about, are we really doing something that needs amending, or do we feel guilt, which is unhelpful guilt, because we just feel bad for disappointing someone else? Is it because we feel bad because we're not people pleasing? Are we feeling bad because we're used to being obedient and now we're choosing ourselves first? So those are really two very different experiences. So getting clear on those values, getting clear on whose values you're crossing, will help you kind of identify what the next step needs to be. I think it's also important to understand that feelings are not fact. So if you feel guilt, it doesn't mean you're doing something bad, right? And oftentimes we feel guilt because we're doing something new and unfamiliar. And the reason it feels bad is because it's new and unfamiliar, not because it's wrong. And so really trying to interrogate, okay, I feel this way, but is it bad? Is it wrong? Is it harming someone? And really questioning the feeling that's coming up for you. And I think that's where you'll be able to parse between unhelpful guilt and helpful guilt. And I think that those are kind of the two things. It's just, I always have to remind people guilt is a warning sign. It's not a stop sign. It's not a neon sign that's telling you to turn around and stop doing the thing you're doing. It's like a yellow light that's saying, slow down, think about why you're doing this. Whose values are you like living by right now? Does it feel bad because it's new? Does it feel bad because you're living by a value that's important to you, but your parents don't respect it or understand it? And that can help you really move forward and build tolerance for feeling guilt, right? I don't know that the goal is to ever eradicate the guilt altogether. I don't even know if that's possible for so many of us who live with guilt. I think it's stopping it from having such a chokehold on you and stopping you from actually doing the things you might want to do or need to do for yourself.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. I've never thought about examining the guilt in that way. Um, but that it can really be informative if you stop and observe what the source of it is. Um, yeah, I had a friend sharing with me about their own guilt in the context of their family yesterday. And I was like, oh, this is something that I think we all sort of experience on different levels.
Mhm.
Um, but I've never something I've been examining too in my own life, but I've never been told to examine like from a values perspective, like where that's coming from. So it's really an insightful way to like use it as information, I feel like, rather than just being like, this is a feeling I don't want to feel. How do I get rid of it? But like, what is this telling me? And where do my own, I guess it's a good opportunity to examine our own values, or are they our values or someone else's values, and what our values actually are. And I know you talk a lot about that in the book. I'm curious too, like with straddling the world of multiple cultural identities. Do you, do you ever I mean, I'm sure this is a part of your experience, but how do you navigate for yourself this concept of values? Because being socialized and raised, you're an American, you were born here, but also living in a household that had a different culture, that came from a different culture. Obviously, there are certain things that you're going to connect to that are values of, you know, your parents' culture and your household culture that you may find that are really valuable in your life. And there are maybe things that are like normalized in the Western culture that you might find are not valuable, and vice versa too, for both of those things. So I'm curious, like, would you mind sharing a little bit about your own experience about that kind of like that's observation around our how you build your personal value system and how people do that in general, and like how do you marry those things if sometimes they oppose each other, sometimes they support each other. um
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. And I have lots of thoughts. So I think the first thing that I've had to do is really question what does it mean to feel culturally enough, right? There are times where I don't feel American. I'm born here, I identify as an American, but I don't feel American. And there are times where I don't feel Indian, despite the fact of growing up in an Indian household, looking Indian, identifying as Indian. And I think for me, a part of that, and with a lot of my clients and people in the community, is that we're often trying to live by someone else's definition of what it means to be enough in that identity. What does it mean to be American enough? What does it mean to be Indian enough? You know, my own parents, my mom will sometimes use American as a bad word to me. She'll be like, you're too American, or that's American, or you're just American. There's a cultural difference, and kind of shut down the conversation. And that used to make me feel so much shame growing up, I used to feel so shameful for being quote unquote too American or not Indian enough. But then I also felt too much shame for being too Indian when I was at school in a predominantly white school where my dad had an Indian accent, or I felt embarrassed, or I felt all these things. So growing up, I think what really worked for me was really questioning whose definition of being enough am I even living by? Like, who does it serve for me to dress a certain way, look a certain way, sound a certain way, be a certain way? And what values is that upholding? And that's how you can start to question, okay, are these values that actually speak to who I am and what I want? There are, cultural values in my household or in the South Asian community or even the immigrant communities at large that I don't feel, sit with me, especially as a woman, especially as a daughter. And then when I think about the American values, there are things about, individualism that I'm like, that doesn't feel totally true to me either. And so it's about blending them. I think for a lot of people who straddle more than one culture, they'll often feel like I'm either this or this, or I have to pick, I have to choose. But in reality, you can be both and you can create kind of this new hybrid identity for yourself where you blend what works for you. And what that does is that helps you feel more pride in your identity rather than shame. So I think when we think about values, if we're living by someone else's values, we're never going to feel totally content or good about ourselves. Going back to the feelings of guilt that come up, sometimes people are so motivated by that guilt to stop feeling that guilt that they keep doing the things that they don't want to do or acting in ways that aren't in service of themselves because they just don't want to feel guilt. And that's also like that's also not the answer because you're then doing yourself a disservice of being your truest self, living out the way that you can actually live your life. And so when we think about values, sometimes what I do with clients is I will literally just ask them, and I have these exercises in the book, but I'll be like, hey, let's just take a couple minutes and I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm going to like name someone and I just want you to tell me the three top values that come to mind. And I'll usually do parents, if they're alive. Sometimes I'll do grandparents if they're a big part of their life or they live with them. I'll do their best friend and they get to decide who that person is. Maybe it's someone in their community, maybe it's someone who's American. I don't know. Siblings, if they have a really close relationship with them. And then I'll do cultures. I'll say, okay, what do you think are the three biggest values in the American culture? They'll name them and then I'll say whatever their heritage culture is. If it's Indian, I'll say, what about Indian culture? And then I will ask them, what are your most ideal values? If you could pick three ideal values for you to live by, what would they be? And then the last question I'll ask them, what are the values you actually live by today? And we will just sit there and we'll have it all written out and we'll look at it and we'll say, well, what do we see? And sometimes it's like, well, I'm seeing that I'm actually living by my mom's values, but I want to be living by this value. Or like, we'll just go over and say, where do you find the overlap? Where do you find the differences? Where do you see the tension? Where do you see that it feels like easy and it actually meshes together? And what that does is it also helps us identify the cultural values, the relationships in which we might feel safer, which we might find more support, which we might find easier to set boundaries because it's easier to set boundaries with people who share in your values, and where we might find more of that tension. And that helps people kind of just see it and externalize it and be like, okay, this is how I can tie these things together, or how do I build a bridge between this value and this value when they're not the same? One thing about values we also have to be mindful of is the beliefs that we tie to them. And so I might have a value of family. My mom might have a value of family, but our beliefs tied to what it means to value family might look very different. She might have a belief that in order to value your family, you have to always be, accessible. You have to pick up the phone all the time. You have to visit me once a month. You have to do this, this, and this. And that's what it means to be family. Whereas my value of family might be, I can give you some space. I don't always have to see you, but I value you and you're one of the most important relationships to me. And so it's not just if you share the same value, it's the beliefs you tie to that value. How does that value play out? And so really thinking about those things and interrogating them is the only way for us to really understand how we differ or overlap with the people we love and how we can then build those bridges that we might want to build.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for offering such a tangible takeaway too for our listeners to even do that exercise like right now. I mean, that's just thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, thank you for everything that you do with your amazing platform, Brown Girl Therapy. And I mean, congratulations too on your new book that's being released that I feel like everything we've talked about is integrated in this book. I think everybody obviously needs to go and buy it right now. Um, but with that said, I personally find having a book to be so helpful and meaningful because it's accessible, right? Maybe not everybody can afford to go out to therapy, or maybe therapy is a little too intimidating at the moment, but having a book offers such accessible, tangible tools and tips to the masses. And so I think that is just so cool. And just congratulations again on releasing this book. And I can't wait for everyone to get it. But as we begin to wrap up, we always conclude with 3 questions. And the first of the 3 is, what are some of your daily self-care practices? How do you take care of yourself day to day?
I try to move my body every day. And so sometimes that is going for a long walk or running or an exercise class. I have been very good as of the last several months of trying to incorporate movement because that just helps me manage my anxiety. It helps me release my energy that's kind of chaotic and just needs to get out of my body. And then reading. So leisure reading, not reading to learn something, not reading to, find out something new. I just want to leisure read with a romance or a thriller and just enjoy and get away. And that just makes me feel like I'm taking care of myself.
Are you into romantasy at all?
I am. I
Okay.
am. I just did the Fourth Wing 2 books and I
Yes.
actually really loved them. And some of my friends will make fun of me when they hear this because apparently some people didn't like it, but
I
I
loved
was a
them too.
fan. I was a
I'm
fan.
a fan. You got to get into ACOTAR. I talk about this
I
all the
know. I
time.
have the first book. I know.
Okay. The
I,
first book is an entry fee because it's all you like. If you got to read, I tell everybody you have to commit to the first 2 books. That's the
okay.
commitment. But,
Okay.
oh my God. Okay. We'll talk about
No.
Fourth Wing offline because I'm obsessed. I heard someone say too, it's like, it's not that it's a good book, but that doesn't mean I didn't like it. Like, right. Like I liked it. I didn't say it was good. I just said I liked it. Right. So I
Yeah.
loved it.
I mean, I loved
So
it too. I was
I
like, how did
loved
people
it.
not like this book? It was so engaging. Yeah, I
Ah,
love
I loved it. Anyway.
it.
That's really funny. Erica's been trying to get me on the train, but I haven't jumped
Oh
on
my God. Well, I will second it. You should.
it. So our second question for everybody is, what does being courageous mean to you?
Oh, that's a good one. I think being courageous is about sometimes being okay with disappointing people because you're doing the thing that you need to do in order to like move forward in something that's important to you. So that might be the relationship, the career, the everyday choices you make. And sometimes they can feel so hard. And we talked about guilt. Guilt can be so debilitating and it can stop us from taking those choices or making those steps. And I think courage is doing that thing anyway.
Thank you. And the last question we ask, even though we just gabbed a little bit about books, is do you have a book that you would like to recommend to your audience other than your own on any topic, just something that's meant something to you or that you've enjoyed reading?
Oh my gosh, I read so many books now. I'm like, oh, which one do I recommend? I just read a book called First Light Wins, which is
Mm,
a thriller that I really loved, and I think it's going to be one of my favorite thrillers for a while.
ooh,
It's really surprising, and even if you read the synopsis, I found that like it has short chapters. It like is integrating a lot of twists along the way. I couldn't put it down. So I would recommend that for a fun little, the weather's getting warmer here on the East Coast, go outside and read a thriller. So read First Lie Wins.
Cool.
mm.
Thank you so much. I love getting it. I love getting like a fun read, referral too. And then if anyone wants to buy your book, find you, if they don't already follow you, where can they do all of that?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at Brown Girl Therapy. You can go to my website, which is sahajkourkohli.com, and you can find all the events I'm doing for my book, all of the kind of resources I have accessible up there, all the stuff about me. And yeah, those are probably the 2 best places to find my work. And you can
Thank
buy the book anywhere that you like to buy your books, or rent it, or ask your local library or local bookstore to have it in stock.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Courageous Wellness. Tune in every Wednesday for a new episode featuring a different guest each week.
Subscribe, rate, and write us a nice review. And you can also follow us on Instagram at Courageous Wellness or get in touch via our website, www.courageouswellness.net, where you can also find additional info about our health coaching services, virtual group events, newsletter, and more.
Until next week, I'm Allie.
And I'm Erica, and we're Courageous Wellness.